diversity of views and stuff represented.
Did Cassie leave?
Yes.
Oh.
She had a scheduled conflict. So what I wanted to do is actually host a conversation about refugees, but in the midst of that, also kind of demonstrate or wrestle with what does it look like to participate well in a conversation of this sort. Because I'm trying to think of the best way to say it. So if you look on social media for more than like 3 minutes right now, all the uproar is over refugees, whether or not the U.S. should take them, whether or not the U.S. should reject them, whether or not you are a true Christian if you reject or accept them, whether or not, anyhow, the list goes on and on. Everyone kind of familiar with this debate, argument, fisticuffs that's happening online. So I want us to together kind of process and think about what does it look like for us to come up with a view on refugees and what is the role that we at Dusk Covenant embrace, even though that might be a multiplicity of views, but also how to have the conversation in a manner that reflects civil discourse, because I think that's one of the parts that is really lacking in this. Okay, so it's kind of like a double value time. One, we can parse out what we think biblically is a sound response to refugees, as well as kind of parse out what it looks like for us to be able to engage each other in civil discourse. So what are some of the rules that you guys want to have for this time when it comes to this? So I would say the first thing is that this is safe space for you to have different opinion than the other person, than the person next to you. That's got to be first and foremost, is that everyone feels completely welcome to share their view and listen to other people's views. That would be one of the rules. Anybody else have a rule?
If someone is offering a perspective, you wait until that person's finished before you respond.
So don't interrupt. Okay. Anything else?
This is more of a question, but how do facts versus opinions fit into it?
Okay, so let's see.
Avoiding fallacies.
What's that?
Maybe avoiding fallacies.
I think ultimately that'll be the goal, but I think sometimes we actually don't even know what a fallacy is. So naming, how would you guys suggest wording that? Because I think that's important. I think facts, opinions are different, and therefore we can have fallacial comments made. It's a joke, by the way.
I think, like you said, I mean, there are times when people don't realize that, that their argument is illogical. But I think there are times when people do, and they're using it anyway because they feel like it's a way to shut down conversation. So maybe something along those lines of communicate fairly, maybe.
Hey.
With a honestly,
yeah.
That's a good one. So what we're doing is we're going to have a conversation about refugees and a biblical response to refugees. because I don't know what your experience has been over the last week or so, but there aren't very many good conversations happening about it. And so we're trying to do a dual thing here where both we engage what is Das Covenant's kind of biblical expression of refugees, and that'll be formed by all of us, not by me. And also how to have civil discourse about such a thing. So what we want to do is, these were rules that we're coming up with as a group. So the communicate honestly one, I think, is the only one that's a little kind of needs some explanation. But the idea is Tony said, differentiating between opinions and facts, and then CJ added avoiding fallacies. And so I think that's the ultimate goal, but I think we all need to I think this is a good way to kind of inform that we need to communicate honestly, recognize when something's emotional versus a fact, and try to be as honest as possible about that when we're talking. So to say I feel versus, it is a fact, right?
One thing I've heard other people say about arguments is like, to make your own argument instead of necessarily trying to invalidate someone else's argument.
Okay.
I don't know if that would be a good rule or.
So you're saying actually like open to a posture shift? Is that what you're hinting towards?
That would be, I'm not exactly sure, but I would agree with what you said.
So posture of student when other people are talking.
There you go.
Yeah.
So that other people's perspectives or views could actually reshape ours. And I think that's one, willingness to learn, which I think is inherent in student, but I want to just state it. If we're not willing to learn, then it doesn't matter.
I think students that are willing to learn are usually the voluntary ones. Which, I mean, to say we're all here, but I feel like grade school kids.
Anything else?
I think it plays into willingness to learn, but a willingness for your claim or perspective to be pressed upon critically. And that not need be something emotional. However, that may be a reality felt. It's not personal, I guess is what I'm saying.
Yeah.
Okay. Anybody else feel like there's anything else? I would say for the most part, none of those really exist on social media. Right? Like you always, I don't know about you guys, but when I get into a conversation on social media and just one of these exists, I'm like, that was a really great conversation.
I think that's what I was saying about like the idea of making your own argument instead of validating others, because on social media, when I happen to interact that way, a lot of it's like, oh, you're wrong, or such and such. Like it's just, they aren't trying to present a counter argument, they just trash on whoever's making the argument.
So let me push back on that. Is I don't think we always have to have an answer to say that the current answer is not right. Like, I don't think we always have to have a solution or even have fully established our own opinion to recognize that an argument is invalid. Does that make sense? So
Yes.
I think there's what you're saying. Like instead of it being our goal to just dismantle everyone else's argument, try and create some of our own. I think that's a really healthy thing that we should do. But I also don't think that to critique someone else's argument without a solution of our own is necessarily wrong.
How about humility? I always think that when I see internet things. It's like, why can't we all just be a little more humble?
I think that what goes into that too is just the benefit of the doubt.
Yeah.
How's that? I think that.
Oh.
All right. Anything else that we feel like is a glaring missing piece? Okay, so over here, I'm going to do I don't know how to change or put a better title, so forgive me on this, but what are some of the arguments you've heard? And so I'm not asking you to take ownership as your own. I just want to list a bunch of things that what have you seen floated around about when it comes to the way we should engage refugees?
Oh,
Like, just, it's not even a question. It's just like, no, it makes no sense to allow refugees into the country.
I actually, whenever I hear about refugees, what I hear is mostly through NPR and referring to the EU and other European countries. So I'm assuming we're talking about like refugees mostly from like the Syrian region. Okay.
So what are some,
Argument of safety.
okay? For
Like
us,
national domestic safety.
Yeah. Yeah, like the selfish safety.
So maybe
I've
like
heard
safety
this
and,
argument
like,
both
national
ways.
security.
So I think for us, so personal, and then I think I've also heard, well, we should be worried about their safety. You know, they're fleeing from something dangerous. So I think it goes along with it. A lot of these are going to overlap. We'd have a really nice Venn diagram.
National.
Because I think that's plays into the safety thing. What about this one?
Financial arguments.
Okay. Any clarifier on that?
Like how do we support new refugees when we're not supporting our current underprivileged populations? That's the right way to bring that.
Nope, I got it. I think one of the arguments that he's seeing is we have X number of veterans that are unhoused, and we're going to have refugees come into the country. How are we going to do that?
I think where it ties into national security and safety, but like the proliferation of terrorist organizations and their capacity to attack.
The whole, they might be terrorists.
Right.
Maybe they really just windmills.
Can you explain that one?
Yeah, like Bill Meyer, or Mayer, how do you say his name, just did a thing where he was talking about refugees, and he said they are not like us. They are Syrian and they are Muslim, and so therefore they are not like us. They're coming from countries that have or want Sharia law. They have different moral expectations and different. So to have an influx of them into our country is a concern.
How would you articulate the racial component of those two like that?
Well, I think we have a very clear picture in the U.S. that we have a race problem. We already see mosques have been vandalized since France. We've seen other Muslim community or people perceived to be Muslim
People kept
attacked.
off of a airline flight.
People taken off of an airline flight. So I think there's just a racial piece to this that is dangerous. I'm not saying racial as in dangerous to but also dangerous to them.
Yeah, I agree, and I ask because that is a component that I'm not seeing being talked about nearly as much, and how the racial component plays into the existing narrative of race relations in this country
Well, I agree, but I think it's because it's being overshadowed
by
by
the
this.
religious,
by
but they're
this.
both like interrelated. But however, one is not being talked about
I agree.
nearly as much.
Which, I don't know, I'm just wondering if ethnicity might somehow integrate both.
I would put it on here. There's no right or wrong answers here, so we're just trying to kind of see, like, here's what we want in our conversation. Here's the conversations that are already existing, and here we're going to have a discussion about how, as those of us who are in this community, how we would use the Bible, use our understanding of faith, in order to engage this conversation on large. So I don't know if you guys read, I did a blog post about this.
Ooh.
And in that blog post, I left room for people to disagree with me. And one of the very first responses I got from someone was, why don't you just have enough guts to take a stand? And that to me is really interesting, that instead of saying, I imagine that there are more ways to view this than just my own, that is offensive, or that would even be a strange way to respond. So I want us to be able to look and imagine what it would look like as a community to talk about this and use biblical foundations for our views. And I don't know if you guys noticed, but I put a biblical response, not the biblical response, right? This is Dust Covenants, this is our group's biblical response to this. So is that helpful for thinking about shaping this conversation?
What about an individual versus statewide or national perspective of like individuals taking in particular refugee families versus like governors or
Okay, so,
people in power saying yes or no?
all right, so,
Good luck putting that into P words.
yeah.
Socio-political standing.
What's that?
Socio-political standing.
Yeah, but I think that is, and I think that is one, but I think what, Kelly, what you're getting at is that a governor of a state might say, no refugees in
Right.
Virginia. But that's actually not something that they have the right to declare.
So-
So you and I, or Dust Covenant Church could, if we had space, house refugees. And so there's an argument about whether or not it should be state sanctioned versus personally sanctioned. Is that?
Yeah, and that stems from, I saw something about a university saying that if each university or liberal arts college or something like that took in a refugee family, it would make a big impact. I don't know what the impact was, but it was big. So that's kind of where I'm coming from.
All right.
Is it like individual rights versus state rights versus federal rights?
I'm not thinking of it in terms of rights, I'm thinking of it in terms of,
Behavior?
behavior, desire to help, kind of thing.
Is that okay? I mean,
Yeah.
at the end of the day, this can't replace what we've said.
So are you talking about like the government versus the citizen? In the sense like the citizen can make the decision to house a Syrian refugee, whereas the government may not.
I don't know much about how the government works, so I don't know what they're doing in terms of if it's right or wrong. or
Right, but
lawful
like,
or-
theoretically, you're like, as opposed to the governor or the mayor being like, no, we're not gonna do this in our state.
More so, like a group think mentality maybe. It's like we're thinking, oh, well, the government's gonna make this decision, so it's gonna be solved. Whereas maybe we get impacted on an
I see what you're saying. Okay. Oh, wow, that's interesting. So a community effort.
Yeah,
Okay.
All right. Anything else we want to put on here? We can always go back and add something as we talk, but is there anything else that just kind of leaps out that you've heard? I'd say one more piece, and maybe it goes in here. There's like a spectrum of no, as in just from verbal to violence. And I think there's a huge spectrum. Like I've heard people that are just like, no, and it's strictly just a self-proclamation, no, I don't think we should do this, to all the way to, no, in fact, I think we should get all of our guns out type thing.
One argument which I don't think is out there is just wondering about our responsibility in creating the situation that they're fleeing from.
Yeah.
You know, we
It is out
destabilized
there, but
this region,
Right.
almost 10 years ago. And it's like these people probably wouldn't have this problem if we, you know, had been more responsible in the first place.
Right.
There's also the question of what would we want them to do for us if we take on something?
I've never heard that. That's interesting.
I don't think we think in those terms
Yeah.
because we're just so
Never had to, really.
Yeah. They're always the
American
takers.
exceptionalism. We
Right.
just don't think anything like that would happen.
All right. Does that seem pretty good for a starting ground? Do you see how we just listed off a whole bunch of things and no one like yelled at each other? Even if some of those are things that you feel. I would say one that we didn't list is one of the arguments about refugees is we should just let as many people come as possible. Just open arms, just welcome that, let people come in. And I don't think that's listed. Most of these, I think, were arguments against, for the most part. I think there's lots of arguments for it as well, which the true Christian, I think, is an argument for.
Yeah, that's how I received it.
All right, so let's think first of all about biblical narratives that we think relate to refugees, like that we can imagine this scenario. What's that? Exodus. Anyone else? All right, first of all, tell me what you mean by the Exodus. How is that reflecting?
Well, I'm just thinking that in the situation in the Exodus story, I mean, they're refugees from Egypt. I mean, they wander around for 40 years and don't really, but.
And how do you think that could inform us for making a biblical response?
I guess, I mean, just on the surface, like the idea of them just having to kind of wander around, like.
I would actually change the wording from them and say that we were once refugees.
Right.
Like, according to our religion,
Right.
according to our faith history, that's why God all throughout the Hebrew text says, remember when I rescued you from slavery, right? Now I realize that for many of us that we don't identify ourselves completely as familial with Israel, but if according to the New Testament we are indeed grafted in or baptized into the Israelites, then the very notion that we were in a situation that was oppressive, violent, death-filled, and we became refugees as we escaped or clamored out. So I think the Exodus narratives where that can be most impactful in developing our idea is to associate ourselves as part of our biblical story is we began as refugees. One of the first actions we see of Israel is as a refugee community. So I listed the Good Samaritan because you have someone who is at odds, most likely, the Samaritan, and most likely a Jewish person that has been beaten and left alongside the road. Those two religions are at odds and even seen as a threat to one another, but the Samaritan still takes care of the needs of the person that was in opposition, even though they have no idea why they were beaten. For all they know, they were a criminal. They were whatever. There's no indication of why this person was beaten and left to die alongside the road. So for me, the Good Samaritan is another passage. So what other passages or
Back in Exodus, didn't we have to send spies to see how we'd be received in locations?
That's a great insight, though.
Now the internet pretty much broadcasts those sentiments.
I like the way you said to spies to see how they'd be received. I think or we'd
Wow,
be
I
received
mentioned
as
that in this conversation. That's
Yeah.
interesting.
yeah. Well, we know that they go back and report that they're giants and they'd crush us.
Right.
They'd probably report very similarly. Any other passages?
It's not so much a passage, but like the whole like historical context into which Jesus is speaking, and not just Jesus, but the
Roman
prophets.
occupation.
Roman occupation, foreign occupation.
I'm gonna put Roman occupation and then I'm gonna put next to it exile.
Yeah.
Because the story in the Bible is constantly of Israel being exiled, being taken into foreign nations, not typically as a refugee, but usually as captives.
Right.
But I still think that can help us inform some of our views. So.
I'm gonna say the wrong names. Wasn't there, was there like somebody who took in two people that were, I'm like really fuzzy on this story. Do you know what I'm talking about, Chris? You kind of made it sound.
Well, she was also, I guess, spared, so to speak, because of her willingness, I believe.
Is it
I don't know who you're
Jericho? Is it the
talking
wall of Jericho?
No,
They escaped out the rope or something.
it's an R, I thought.
I thought
Rahab.
so. Rahab, was it Rahab?
Rahab is from what Tony was saying.
Is it? I wasn't sure.
A little bit,
Like, that
yeah.
she
it
like
ties in.
hides two people.
She hides the spies that go into Jericho.
Oh, okay.
So, yeah.
There you go. Sorry.
Tony was on.
But I think that's a secondary way of looking at spies. Well, that wasn't the primary thing I was thinking of the time. But thinking about the Exodus, it's not just about them leaving Israel, but they went into Israel not exactly as refugees, but like fleeing famine, right?
They went to Egypt.
You're right. Israel went into Egypt,
Right. So
fleeing things.
we could say
Fleeing as well.
Israel into Egypt.
I think the Exodus story can be an argument over here of some of these, because when Israel goes into Canaan, they're commissioned to kill the Canaanites. Like, if you're Canaan, if you're the people that live in Canaan, then you're not viewing this resettlement of the Israelite people very positively. So I think that there's room to even say that this can actually feed into this piece.
Like the Gibeonites, when Israel starts conquering Canaan, they pretend to be wanderers and save themselves by trickery.
So are you asking me to write that, or are you,
I don't know. Yes, please write that down.
what am I writing down? Something much shorter than what you just.
Gibeonites.
I wonder, and I would welcome group feedback, if there's a way to imagine Adam and Eve leaving the garden. Or being exiled from the garden.
Anything else?
Are refugees considered to be our neighbors?
The nativity narrative, the birth of Jesus. I mean,
Hmm.
Joseph and Mary were like, I mean, not refugees, but they could like they kept going places and kept getting turned away.
Yeah, it's just, I think that that's a little blown out of proportion. That's a nice little meme, but I don't think that's actually biblical. I think that the more the more accurate biblical picture would have been that Jesus, Mary, and Joseph went back to family to stay at their family's home during the census because that's what they were supposed to do. And there was no place for them to sleep up in the loft with the other family members, also called the inn. And so they slept with the animals in the lower portion of the facility. I don't think it was quite what we've turned it into, where they were going from door to door knocking and not finding any place to sleep.
Wasn't Moses in a sense a refugee?
Absolutely.
He was, like, fleeing.
Taken in. He was even taken in by
Right.
the Pharaoh.
Yeah.
So
I'm gonna put nativity, though I personally think that the memes about that
Sure,
are culturally or contextually inaccurate, but it makes a great meme. So Moses in Pharaoh's household. I think we also have, and also what's his father-in-law's name? Starts with a J.
Jeremiah Mormon.
That is not correct. Although that might be an alternative
Did you just say
translation.
that?
Jethro?
Jethro?
It is Jethro.
Which happens to be a guy from NCIS.
Yeah.
Is also in this case you have Moses fleeing from Egypt and
Well-
being taken in.
Sorry, let me interrupt you. You also have Jesus fleeing from his area into Egypt to avoid murder, essentially, as far as the author is communicating.
All right, what about ones against? Like this one could be. Like, let's not just think about like the ones that are cuddly, soft puppy dogs.
Well,
Cities of refuge.
how many?
How would a city of refuge be a negative?
Oh, sorry. Because they're housing murderers.
Okay.
Sorry. Maybe it's not fluffy.
I just am not followed. I mean, it has refuge in its name.
Yes.
The Israelites conquered a bunch of people
Yeah,
as they
that's what I
were
was
wandering
trying
around.
to think of. Can't remember which was the Amorites one of them?
I think that was true.
Like they just kept going around doing slaughtering.
What about don't wear mixed fabrics?
Oh.
Not two seeds, one field.
Unyoked. Or unequal.
Unevenly
Unbelievers
yoked.
and unbelievers.
What do you mean by that last one? I mean that there's a great tradition in Christianity that there are some people that are fleeing from the world, but unless they say the right password at the entrance, it doesn't matter. That they're going to face hell. Now, I would argue that that isn't necessarily something that this community would hold. But there are lots of churches that hold this view. And you can be a nice person, and you can be fleeing a whole lot of junk in your life. But once you get to the kingdom, you get to the boundaries of the kingdom. If you don't say the right word or have the right handshake, you're not going to be left in. The doors will shut. They'll be weeping and gnashing of teeth. Right? There will come a time when the gates are closed and you will be outside. So this is probably more fairly
NOAA flood.
Okay, and how do you mean that?
Like how the vast majority of the world was intentionally not saved.
Okay. Just gonna put the few. Can you think of anything else?
I wouldn't say that Jonah was a refugee, but wasn't he going to Nineveh and didn't really want to because of the place
Okay.
that it was?
So even in this instance, it's not waiting for them to come to Israel. Israel actually goes to them.
It's really complicated because when I think about refugees, I think about the situation they're fleeing from and the violence that's happening there. And then I think about the responses to eradicate that violence, which I hear a lot of just complete kind of like Sodom and Gomorrah kind of destruction. Like these people are so wicked that there's no opportunity or even possibility of reconciliation. However,
How do you spell it wrong?
if we deny refugees, I don't know what I mean by that, okay, but if we deny refugees, leave them in that situation, and then react to the violence in that situation with drone strikes or some kind of destruction, I mean, we've created a even worse situation.
I think the Sodom and Gomorrah thing, the Ezekiel 16:49 passage.
Yeah.
All right. Does this feel like I mean, obviously, we could spend a few days going through the text. The text really is, at the end of the day, about a persecuted people who are wandering and constantly trying to find safety and refuge. That is the biblical narrative. So I think we could continue to mine for the rest of the day, and I don't want to do it. We have like 15 minutes left. So what I'd like to do is actually ask you guys, in light of scripture, in light of these arguments, what do you think, how do you think we as a community, so let's imagine that Dust Covenant was going to put on its website our statement about refugees. How would you guys want that to sound or look like? How would you want that to look?
My first thought was to go through and edit it, make it politically correct and all that stuff, but honesty is probably a better approach there.
Okay.
People aren't going to agree with the way it's worded or what we're saying. It's our statement. Don't sugarcoat it.
Okay. So what are some things, and this is where we might disagree, so just know that. So what are some things that we would say represents our community's views, even if that's vast? Anybody willing to share what they think about this? And just be aware that your view might be different than someone else's, so word it in a manner that gives people space to also speak and not feel silly or whatever.
I know very little about the specifics, but if they have nowhere to live, they're poor, they can't feed themselves, we should clothe and shelter them. And that doesn't necessarily mean fill up every room we have in the building, as opposed to providing them with something.
We argue on the point that where they are currently is not safe,
Or is that something that we can like agree on?
Are you asking if we as a community agree that where they are is not safe currently?
Yeah, because I've seen arguments that basically say they've got to make their own bed or something like that. Like
Right.
they made this own, there's their own situations. They should deal with it and stay there.
You made your bed, now you lie in it.
Yeah.
Sandra, I think we made the bed.
Well, I would say also, I mean, almost all the arguments I've heard recently is the exact same arguments I've heard people make about why, about people's hesitation to care for the homeless. Like, most of these things are very, very similar. They made their bed, now they have to lie in it. They're all ex-cons, so safety.
They don't want to create dependency.
Don't want to create dependency. Racial, religious, ethnicity arguments also with unhoused. So in a lot of ways, these arguments that I've heard about refugees are not new arguments. It's arguments that we've used in reference to the impoverished in our communities for quite some time. So part of the argument, part of the statement that I also would like is something to the effect of, this is not new. This argument, this conversation, this debate is not a new debate. It might be a particularly new or infused subject in the fact that it's Syrian refugees. But the idea of taking care of people that don't have the means to take care of themselves at the moment is an argument that has existed for a long time. So I think part of it would be, in a statement I want to say, this isn't a new debate. There is, we've often fought the mindset of personal responsibility and ignored systemic or imposed issues that have been created from the outside, which I think is what you were saying, and Tana, what you reiterated. What else? Anything else? Do you think that our argument about safety, the argument that you see online about safety, do you think, one, do you think it's justified? Two, do you think you understand why people make that
Do you
argument?
mean protecting our own safety?
What's that?
Do you mean the aspect of like our national security and protecting our own safety, that kind of thing? Or do you talk about safety for them?
Our safety. Like, though I disagree on that, I don't think it's it wasn't refugees that took down the towers in New York City, right? It wasn't refugees that blew up the car bomb in New York City. Where was that? That was
Boston. Oh, no, that was
No?
a car bomb.
no, the car bomb in the parking underneath of the building. I think it was the World Trade Center also prior, just wasn't successful.
There was a
yeah.
bombing of the WTC in, I think, '93.
Yeah.
And then you have the Christian man in Kansas City,
Oklahoma. Timothy McVeigh.
Timothy McVeigh. You had the bombing in Boston. None of these individuals were refugees that I'm aware of. So the threat exists regardless of refugees. So I think in some ways it's overstated. However, I understand it. Like, I can, as someone who is pretty emotional person, I can understand the fear that comes with folks coming in. I think we're treating.
Yeah, from what I can gather, it seems like it's not so much the fear of like refugees doing this, it's the fear of terrorists posing as refugees.
Wolves in sheep's clothing.
Correct. And I can understand that. And so like theologically, biblically, I'm absolutely open for borders to be open. But again, what that looks like politically in action with policy and legislation, I have no idea.
I think the thing that frustrates me about that argument though is that we keep making the argument from the few to create an entire policy, a policy to affect like an entire, certain type of group of people. Like, oh, there might be a few drug addicts that are getting welfare that, whatever. So we're gonna do this thing to like that's gonna make it more difficult for everybody, or and yeah, so it's that same thing. Like there might be a few terrorists that pose as refugees to come in, so we're gonna like leave all these people to their own devices. I don't know. I can't get behind that argument personally.
Anyone disagree with Tom?
I think we have government agencies that are supposed to handle those kinds of cases. Maybe I'm agree. I don't know. So if they do come through, and we're not going to know unless we have lots of profilers identifying every single person that comes in, and it has to be over a long period of time. But and I think to tie it into some of the safety issues, the number of refugees you take in. The more you take in, the closer they are together, the more likely they could do something in numbers that would make it unsafe for us. But smaller groups, less likely. Again, you could have people coming in, but
I just think how often have we seen refugees been the one to enact violence? Like I can't think of an example, but maybe there are. But to my mind,
In France, one of the people that were part of the French attacks was linked to refugee.
That's been disputed.
Yeah.
But not
Passport
disproven though,
is-
right? It's just
Right.
disputed.
Right, the passport is not verifiable.
Right.
Because that's another part of the problem is we can't identify these people they're coming out of unstable countries because they have no documentation that's
Right. Yeah.
That's open. Yes.
yeah, that's solid.
Well, and I've read that the refugee process is really thorough and long. Like the process you have to go through to be considered a refugee and all this stuff. So it's not like we're just opening the door and everybody's running through.
Or it can take months or years to
Right.
I guess the point I was making is that when I think about refugees, I mostly think of violence being done to them. Like that is what comes to mind, and that's offhand. I also can't think of any examples, but I have something in me says that that's much more a likelihood than the other way around, them creating violence.
But can you imagine what will happen if a terrorist act happens in the United States and it is linked to Syrian refugees coming into the U.S.? Like the tremendous outpouring of hatred and violence that will end up coming most likely. Kristen.
I'm really sensitive to terms. So when you said terrorist attack, do you mean a terrorist attack done by a Muslim for their religious convictions?
I did not say Muslim.
Right.
I just said terrorist attack. Just like Timothy McVeigh was a
But you're
terrorist
saying
attack.
it's linked to refugees though, right?
Yes.
So it just makes me think about the way to think about terrorism then.
Why?
Well, because acts of terrorism have happened in this country that are independent of brown-skinned Muslim people. So when we say something like, but if it happens and it's linked to refugees,
There's still gonna be backlash,
Right,
right?
but we think about it differently though.
We do.
Yes,
Not
I
fair.
wasn't making a difference.
No, I know you were.
Okay,
That's
I thought
why-
that's what you were asking me.
No.
That's why I was gonna say something along the similar lines,
Yeah.
where, like, we don't discriminate against every, like, white guy in his 20s, because that tends to be
Who does
who
mass
blows
murders?
up things and goes into schools and shoots them up. But we do put that on other people.
You can say something, CJ.
Yeah, that the majority of terrorists are white young men,
Mhm.
and they're portrayed in the media as mentally ill lone wolves.
Right.
And as a problem of the mental health system, not of culture, gun
Right.
control,
Or
or
of Christianity
man.
or.
religion, or ideology. It's a mental health issue, always with only that group.
Yeah.
All right, so we only have a couple minutes left, and obviously we didn't solve refugees. But what do you guys feel like you can take from this to potentially further the conversation outside of this space?
For me, it would not be so much the content of the arguments or the biblical response, but more just like the rules for discourse.
I was gonna say we could just take a picture of the whiteboard with us.
Literally, I've taken away. So
Oh, 20.
Any other thoughts?
I think it was interesting to hear the negative perspective of the response to refugees. I hadn't thought of it that way. I always try to look at the positive side.
Good, I'm glad.
That's like the meme that was going around about refusing refugees, and it was like Indians with the Englishmen. And people were like, that's a bad example because the Englishmen came in and wiped out the Indians, so you don't want to use that. Like, they were using it as an argument.
Right.
it's kind of
Anything more on that?
I mean, I don't know how to turn these arguments around into something that's more supportive of humanity. But it's interesting it helps me not say, no, you're wrong, how could you even think that this is a Christian response to people? Because I can understand a little bit more of how they might, even if this isn't their thought process, how they might do it with more compassion towards their thoughts.
Chrissy is on.
Well, I was just gonna say, building off what Kelly said, it's an exercise in critical thinking and helps you develop a more rounded way of viewing the entire conversation. Because I've never thought about reasons to not. And then when you asked that question, I was like, wow, I don't even know what I would say. And that's a problem.
Anybody else?
I mean, xenophobia is, I think, a huge part of the history of the United States, which we overlook a lot. You know, like was Hans saying, just about the Native Americans and the Englishmen, but then think about even as recently as World War II that we denied entrance to many Jews consistently pre-World War II, despite knowing very well the behavior of Germany, and that we denied a lot more than we could have. But then when we finally did let them in, that the over and over we see that refugees has strengthened our nation. Like the reason we're probably such a powerful nation is because we had so many great minds flood the U.S. and congregate here because of World War II and the refugees of Jews. And
No,
then
I think that's fair. That's really just opinion. You see what I'm saying? Like you can't prove that
Prove what?
we're a stronger country because of refugees.
we
What
wouldn't
about
have made
German
that an atom
scientists?
bomb without it.
That you don't know that. We
Yeah, I guess-
can't reverse
yeah.
through history and say it would have never happened if Thomas Edison never made it past childhood, would we not have incandescent bulbs?
Okay.
I think we.
Yeah, somebody else probably would have stepped in.
We still would have, so I don't disagree, but I'm just letting you know that this is where it's easy to flip between fact and opinion and actually be convinced that our opinions that we're sharing are facts. And it's really easy to do. In fact, several of the things that we've said have just been really opinions and aren't really actually facts. So go ahead, keep going, I'm sorry. Because I agree with you, but it's my opinion.
maybe I'll talk more about this after. But also just the idea that we're letting in these refugees from Syria, and then a counterpoint I wonder about is just all the, what's in my mind are also the refugees from the rest of the America. That how many people are fleeing persecution in South America that the United States has also helped generate, but we just refer to those people as immigrants, and we don't want to face the reality behind their situations.
That's a fair question. Well, the thing I hope that you guys all take away from this is that a single sentence meme is not helpful. And though you may have strong opinions about this, there is space for other people to disagree with you. And there are ways that we can have this conversation that is honoring to our faith and is honoring to the text. That doesn't mean that we agree. And though I'm convinced personally on my opinion when it comes to refugees about what I hope and pray is the healthy Christian response, I have to leave room that other people are just as genuine and intentional about their faith as I am that disagree with me. Because I think if we actually had time to get to the nitty gritty of process, I think that's where we would start to see we disagree with each other, right? Like I think if we were to kind of get down into how many, where are they able to come through, how rigorous is the checkpoints and all of that, and where and how many people X, Y, and Z, like I think at that point we'd start to see more disagreement. And we need to learn how to sit well in disagreement because one, very few conversations are won when you dig your heels into the sand and you are unmovable. I think that these rules, if you find you're online particularly, and these rules are not being honored by you, you should probably not be in the conversation. If you recognize the other people are not abiding by these rules, know that you're probably not going to get anywhere, but that doesn't give you permission to get off of these rules. Right? Especially if we want to say that we want to be biblical and we want to be faith-centered in our response and interactions to these important things. So if we would have had a larger group here today, I think we would have seen at least a little bit more broad of a view. And I think that that's important to recognize that even within our small community, there is going to be a broadness of view on this topic. And I would never question whether any of you are trying to give a biblical response, right? And I think this is where it comes to giving the benefit of the doubt to one another. Is there some really unhealthy behavior out there and expression? Yep. And I've heard it from both sides, saying that people aren't true Christians unless they agree with me, is not a healthy response, and it's a logical fallacy, right? No matter how much we feel that, and we think any true Christian would not behave this way, that is a logical fallacy. And so we just need to be aware and give grace and pray for our leadership, pray for one another, pray for our own behaviors, that maybe we can show a way that's healthy and good for as many people as possible. All right, let me pray and then we'll do prayer requests and then we'll wrap.